is the Vietnam conflict. It basically ate him up and ruined his political career. And people often forget the good things he did during his administration because of it. But before we get into the Vietnam War, we're going to talk about the background on the country of Vietnam and tell you how we ever got involved in this thing in the first place. So the first subtopic is background on the country of Vietnam. I mean, not being kosher here, but does anybody know where Vietnam even is? Southeast Asia, pretty close to what? Korea, in that area, okay? So it's clear across the ocean, so to speak. Does anybody know who controlled Vietnam in the 1940s and 1950s? It was, very good, Pierce, France. France had control of Vietnam in the 40s and the 50s. They controlled the country of Vietnam. And we had several chances in the old days to talk about rewriting history. We had several chances during those administrations, presidential administrations in the 40s and 50s, to ally with Vietnam rather than ally with France. And because we allied with France, we ended up eventually in a conflict that cost 58,000 American lives. So, really this could have been avoided if we'd have made different choices at the time. Now, during this time of the 1940s, 1950s, which led up to that comment I made, France was always in some sort of a conflict with the country of Vietnam because they didn't want to be controlled by the French. And the United States always supported the French in that conflict, okay? And so during the 1940s and 50s, during the time that Vietnam was under French control, France had been involved in a lengthy war with mainly North Vietnam. And finally, after 8 years of fighting the North Vietnamese to no avail, France finally just gave up and left the country, okay? So, kind of backing up again, in the 40s and 50s, Vietnam was under French control. The Vietnamese, especially the people in the north part of Vietnam, did not like French control. They fought back and forth for 8 years, and finally the French said, we've had enough, it doesn't seem to be a war we can win, and so they simply withdrew from Vietnam. Well, once the French withdrew from Vietnam, an international agreement basically divided Vietnam into two parts. And this is really important you understand this. Vietnam was divided in half after the French left. Kind of might remind you a little bit of Germany, okay? The northern part of Vietnam would be under communist control. The northern part of Vietnam would be under communist control, and they would be led by a dictator called Ho Chi Minh, which is on your ID sheet. So the northern part of Vietnam, after the French withdrew, became communist. It would be led by a dictator by the name of Ho Chi Minh, and the capital city of North Vietnam would be Hanoi. So after the French withdrew, Vietnam is basically split in half by an international agreement. The northern part of Vietnam is communist, led by a dictator, Ho Chi Minh, and the capital city was Hanoi. South Vietnam, on the other hand, was under democratic control, or non-communism. They were led by a democratic leader by the name of No Dinh Diem, although it's not spelt like that, No Dinh Diem. He was a democratic leader, and Saigon would be the capital city of South Vietnam. So the southern part of Vietnam would be democratic under the leadership of No Dinh Diem, a democratic leader with Saigon as the capital. Well, use your common sense when we talked about Korea. What happened? What caused this conflict in Vietnam? What's that? The North, there was rumors going around that North Vietnam wanted to unite the two countries and have them both ruled under communist rule. But we weren't going to allow that. And they didn't want that. The people of South Vietnam did not want a unification that would make them communist. And who's president at the time when this kind of starts up? Dwight D. Eisenhower. Okay? So Eisenhower kind of gets and inherits this problem that after France left Vietnam and they unified separately, so to speak, North communist, South non-communist, the rumors started to swirl during the Eisenhower administration that the North wanted to take over the South. Same thing happened in Korea, did it not? And Eisenhower wasn't going to see that happen. He did not want to see that. Now, he stated to Diem, the leader of South Vietnam, that he will do everything to ensure that South Vietnam remain non-communist. Eisenhower assured Diem the United States would support South Vietnam and make sure they would be free of communism, because he was very concerned, he being Eisenhower, of the domino effect, which is on your ID sheet, in Southeast Asia. So Eisenhower meets with Diem and he assures Diem that we will support South Vietnam in their freedom against communism, because Eisenhower was worried about the domino effect in Southeast Asia. Dave, what does that mean?
That was if one country fell to communism.
Absolutely. If one country fell to communism in Southeast Asia, all of them were going to fall. Who was the major concern? What was the biggest communist country in Southeast Asia? China. Yeah. And we didn't want to see that. So Eisenhower was committed. You got to remember that in earlier history, China had been taken over by communism. And you got to also remember that the United States sacrificed a lot of American soldiers, and you witnessed the Korean Wall in defending North Korea from taking South Korea over and turning it into communism. So this wasn't a new trick, okay? China fell to communism. That's why we stayed in North Korea and fought in Korea to make sure that South Korea would not become communist, and that's why we're going to commit to the people of South Vietnam as well. Because we don't want to see the domino effect. We don't want to see all these countries in Southeast Asia go communist. So, as a result, keep in mind that it was during the Eisenhower administration that the first military aid and military advisors were sent to South Vietnam. 800 military advisors and military aid. The first aid that we gave to the country of South Vietnam came during the Eisenhower administration, when he sent 800 military advisors to South Vietnam along with military aid. Did Eisenhower send troops? No. Now, this will take us to our next subtopic, because this happens late in the Eisenhower administration. So who inherits the Vietnam problem? President Kennedy. And that takes us to the next subtopic, which is President Kennedy and the issue of Vietnam. And I think you'll find this kind of surprising. Now, when President Kennedy took office, he had originally been impressed with South Vietnamese Prime Minister Diem. He was impressed by him. He liked him. So Kennedy's first impression of the South Vietnamese leader Diem was a positive one. And the reason that he liked Diem is because Kennedy took a trip to Vietnam when he was a senator in the late 1950s, because of this issue that was brewing up there. Kennedy actually traveled as a senator to Vietnam in the late 1950s and took a liking to Prime Minister Diem. Thought he was a good guy. Thought he was a good leader. He was impressed with him. Well, by the time Kennedy was elected president, Diem was no longer seen in the same light by Kennedy, because Diem changed. He became more cruel, he became almost a dictator, and he controlled his opposition through intimidation and imprisonment. So he became kind of a dictator in a non-communist country. And Kennedy all of a sudden had concerns that Diem was not the right fit for the people of South Vietnam if they were going to commit to non-communism. Does that make sense? So after time went on, Diem became more cruel, he became more dictatorial, he controlled anyone that opposed him within the country with intimidation and imprisonment, and Kennedy lost his vision of that Diem was a good person. Okay? Now, when did Kennedy's interest in Vietnam surface? Okay, he didn't really care about Vietnam, didn't think it was that important before what events happened in his presidency. Absolutely, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the events in another communist, non-communist conflict, Berlin. So after Kennedy's presidency, and he went through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then he saw what happened in Berlin and East and West Germany, he became interested in Vietnam. Prior to that, he really didn't show a lot of interest in Vietnam. He didn't think it was worth worrying about, okay? Because he was tied up in the Cuban Missile Crisis and worried about the events of Berlin. And even when he got interested in Vietnam, this is very important you understand, he did not think it was a place that positive things could be accomplished. Even when he got interested, he did not see Vietnam as a place that could be positive. He also made it very clear that he did not want to be involved in a war with Vietnam. Made that very clear, and we'll give you an example of that later. He did not want to get into a war or be involved in any kind of a war in Vietnam. What would he do, though? What would he do in Vietnam?
Send support.
Continue to support them, as Eisenhower did. So although he was not interested in being involved in a war in Vietnam, he did believe the United States should assist them in their fight without committing what?
Soldiers.
Troops. Very good. So Kennedy increased the amount of military aid to South Vietnam, the amount of advisors. He increased what Eisenhower had done, but he did not send initially any troops because he did not believe that that was the war to get into. Now, how many advisors did Eisenhower send? 800. Kennedy sent about 16,000 additional advisors, not soldiers, but advisors, not troops. I shouldn't say soldiers because he sent military personnel there to advise, but not troops, okay? So he sent about 16,000 there. Now, this is, I think, very important that you understand Kennedy's philosophy in Vietnam. On Monday, September 2nd, 1963, Monday, September 2nd, 1963, just 2 months prior to his assassination, John Kennedy sat down with CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite and made his intentions concerning Vietnam very clear in that interview. Okay? I'll repeat that. On Monday, September 2nd, 1963, just 2 months prior to his assassination, President Kennedy did an interview with CBS. Did I already give you that? All right, perfect. With CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite. And during the course of this interview, he answered several questions that were proposed by Cronkite on the interview. And finally, the topic came to Vietnam. Now, I got extras. Look in your binders and find this little conversation right here. I didn't realize I gave all this to you, I think, before after the last test, didn't I? And this was the interview that Kennedy had with news reporter Walter Cronkite on September 2nd, 1963, concerning Vietnam. And I want you to read through it with me. Cronkite says, "Mr. President, the only hot war we've got running at the moment is, of course, the one in Vietnam. And we have our difficulties there, quite obviously." Kennedy's response, "I don't think that unless a greater effort is made by the government to win popular support, that a war can be won out there. In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones that have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it. The people of Vietnam against the communists. We are prepared to continue to assist them, but I don't think that the war can be won unless the people support the effort, and in my opinion, in the last 2 months, the government has gotten out of touch with the people." Cronkite says, "Do you think this government has time to regain the support of the people?" President Kennedy says, and he's talking about the South Vietnamese government, he says, "I do. With changes in policy and perhaps with personnel, I think it can. If it doesn't make those changes, I would think that the chances of winning it would not be very good. Cronkite says, hasn't every indication from Saigon been that President Diem has no intention of changing his pattern? What is his pattern? Cruelty, intimidation. And Kennedy says, if he does not change it, of course, that is his decision. He has been there 10 years, and as I say, he has carried this burden when he has been counted out on a number of occasions. Our judgment is that he can't be successful on this basis. We hope that he comes to see that, but in the final analysis, it is the people and the government itself who have to win or lose this struggle. All we can do is help, and we are making it very clear. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That would be a great mistake. I know people don't like Americans to be engaged in this kind of effort. 47 Americans have been killed in combat with the enemy, but this is a very important struggle, even though it is far away. We took all this, made this effort to defend Europe. Now Europe is quite secure. We also have to participate, we may not like it, in the defense of Asia. What do you read he's saying there? Is he going to commit troops to Vietnam? No. The 47 that have been killed are what? Advisors who got in the wrong place at the wrong time. He has no intention, in my opinion, to commit American troops, ground troops, to fight in Vietnam. He says right up there, in the end, they are the ones who have to win it or lose it. The reason I bring that up is because many historians believe if President Kennedy had not been assassinated, he would have allowed Vietnam to fend for themselves, and you probably wouldn't have a Vietnam War, nor would you have a Vietnam Veterans Memorial. That's just something to think about. Well, let's take us to the next subtopic then, which is the fall of Prime Minister Diem. The fall of Prime Minister Diem. Well, after you are treated poorly for a period of time, what do you think the South Vietnamese people began to think? What's that? Well, or let's get rid of this guy, right? I mean, this guy is being brutal, he's being unfair, he's being almost a dictator in a non-communist country. So by the early 1960s, the South Vietnamese people were growing very, very tired of Diem's leadership. And Prime Minister Diem was viewed as corrupt by his own citizens within South Vietnam. They saw him as a corrupt leader. Our modern day terms, he was what? A bully, right? Well, what happens when you get tired of a leader? The military gets together and they plan a coup, or an overthrow of the leader of the government. And in August of 1963, a coup against the leadership in South Vietnam was planned by the South Vietnamese military. The people had had enough of Diem, and they were prepared to plan a coup to overthrow Diem and the government by the military in South Vietnam. Now, interestingly enough, this plan was fully supported by none other than Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Does that name ring a bell, sort of? Kennedy defeated him, remember, in the senatorial race. He also defeated Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. when he ran with Richard Nixon in 1960. And what Kennedy had done is he had appointed Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam. And Henry Cabot Lodge is telling President Kennedy this would be a good thing to support, a coup that would overthrow South Vietnamese Prime Minister Diem. He's a bad guy, he's treating the people poorly, he's bullying them, he's intimidating them, he's imprisoning them, that they don't agree with him. This would be a good thing to support. So in October of 1963, the Kennedy cabinet got together and they began to discuss a possible American backing of this coup. They would support the overthrow of another country's government. They're meeting to talk about that. Are we going to do that? Are we going to support this coup by the South Vietnamese military to overthrow the government? Well, There was mixed support among the Kennedy cabinet. Some members supported the coup, others opposed it. The three main players that spoke either way were Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and General Maxwell Taylor. All familiar names. They're the ones that spoke more vehemently about the plan one way or the other, and I'm going to give you their opinions. So the main players that spoke during this meeting were Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, and I feel bad that I did not take you down to see General Maxwell Taylor's gravesite because it was right by the tomb of the unknown soldier, and I forgot. But it's there. He's buried right below the tomb of the unknown, Maxwell Taylor. Now, also involved in the discussion was Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Now, let's try to point it out. Robert Kennedy, support or not support the coup? No, spoke against it. Defense Secretary McNamara, for or against supporting the coup? Against. General Maxwell Taylor, for or against supporting the coup?
For.
Against. The only one that supported the overthrow of Diem was Secretary of State Dean Rusk. And he had a reason, and I'll tell you the reason. But he felt we should support the coup. And he did that because Diem would not take any of American officials' suggestions about solving his relationship problems with his people. The United States got involved and tried to be the mediator and tried to give him some suggestions on, hey, you need to kind of change your ways here. The people aren't liking it. And he was so upset at Diem for never taking any suggestions on how to improve the relations. His